Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am again joined by Right Ruminations. We're here today to discuss the intra-traditional or conservative Catholic debate of the Thomists versus the traditionalists. So, Right Ruminations, why don't you set this up for us?
Thank you, Todd. The Thomists are, as their name suggests, people whose philosophy dates back to the antecedent of St. Thomas Aquinas, who introduced Aquinas's thinking in a systemized way into Christianity. This was a move that served to, I think, intellectualize Catholicism and also was not really a conservative move in its day. Aquinas's followers were initially persecuted in the University of Paris, where if one entertained certain Aristotelian ideas publicly, one could suffer excommunication. The effect of Thomas's work was twofold, I think. On the one hand, it served to systematize Christian doctrine in a way that was suggestive of a kind of modern or proto-modern philosophy. That is, every question has an answer. Every answer is in reference to some overarching system, so it has a certain architectural or formalistic quality. However, Thomas also was surprisingly open-minded, I think, by the usual standards of Christian philosophy, in that he was willing to deal in terms of this scholastic method of point versus counterpoint as a means of arriving at the truth. So somebody gets up and in a university is meant to give the best argument against God's existence, and then someone counters that with the best arguments in favor of God's existence. What I would say about the whole Thomistic tradition is that there are kind of these two paradoxical aspects. On the one hand, it's a kind of ideology, which it relates to, eventually becomes the manualistic tradition, where theology is taught in a very formulaic way. But on the other hand, the other end of the paradox is that it is something which actually pops the hood, as it were, of a theology, or at least theocentric philosophy, in a way that opens it to question and intellectual flexibility and critique, at least hypothetically. Now, another parallel tradition in some ways to Thomism is that of traditionalism. Traditionalism is, in Catholicism, something that overlaps with non-Catholic forms of traditionalism. In the West, maybe its most credible progenitor would be Pico della Mirandola, but it did become a conservative endeavor at the time of the French Revolution and at the time of the Ancien Regime in France. It was something that was Platonic in nature, in that it did contain, I think, from the beginning, certain esoteric elements. So if you look at somebody who's popular on the alt-right today, like Julius Evola, for example, or René Guénon, these people were not entirely separate in terms of their traditionalist expression from the Catholic tradition, and they both, I think, elevate a kind of sense of hierarchy or of an organic societal structure, which is then seen to be intertwined with ideas of like meditative or contemplative esotericism on the part of a priest or elite class. Now, there are two reasons that this traditionalism in Catholicism is brought up, arises in the context of the French Revolution. One is that kind of antecedent to the French Revolution, even though in some ways it's what the French Revolution was acting against, was Gallicanism, which was a movement within French reactionary thought, which emphasized the power of the French monarchy against the papacy. This, to my understanding, is associated with Cardinal Richelieu and the suppression of the Jesuits in France, and with the Ancien regime more generally, although there is this perpetual interplay, I think, between ultramontane impulses and Gallican impulses in France. So one thing that traditionalism in this regard emphasizes is a reaction against Gallicanism, because traditionalism places very much an emphasis on the primacy of the Pope, and also of a kind of sovereignty inherent in empire. And this is something that is, I think, lost on a lot of modern reactionaries, is that the kind of traditionalist school, at least as it predates fascism, as you'd find it not only in these 18th century traditionalists, but also in Julius Evola and the traditionalist pagan thinkers, is that they're actually hostile to the nation state, which they see as in opposition to the kind of primitive imperial structure inherent in traditional societies. Now, another reason that the traditionalists rise against, or in the context of the French Revolution, is because they are opposed to the rationalism of the French Revolution. That is, they see the French Revolution as being a revolt against traditional ecclesiastical and aristocratic structures. The kind of figurehead in Catholicism of traditionalism at this time would be Joseph de Maistre, who I think was a Corsican thinker, who is almost sort of like the Evola of Catholicism, although it predates Evola by 200 years, roughly. And de Maistre was very much an anti-rationalist, and also an advocate of ultramontanism. And for a while, the Catholic Church likes this. And Todd mentioned in the chat he thinks he was Savoyard. That may be, as I said, I was uncertain. It slipped my mind. Anyhow, he is the Catholic Church looks favorably on this because they see it as an aid against the French Revolution, and also as helping to uphold the primacy of the papacy. However, this tension, a tension begins to arise between the traditionalists and the Thomists, in that in the 19th century, Aquinas becomes more and more to be seen as a sort of singular philosopher of Roman Catholicism. Now, this is a process that's been going on since the Council of Trent, but it becomes more intensified with the late modern popes, like Pius IX, Pius X, and in particular Leo XIII, who publishes an encyclical essentially instating Thomism as the official philosophy of the Catholic Church, and termed the perennial philosophy, kind of ironically in this context, because it's the traditionalists who see themselves as perennialists. Furthermore, Benedict XV actually writes Thomism into canon law, and basically requires, for all intents and purposes, seminarians to become Thomists, which I think is a rather bizarre move, but nevertheless, you can see the text in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. It is there, which, by the way, is no longer in force as of the more recent Code of Canon Law. Now, this tension between the traditionalists and the Thomists happens for a couple of reasons. One is that the Thomists see the traditionalists as attacking Aquinas and scholasticism for rationalism. That is, they see them downplaying rational arguments in favor of God's existence. And they also see them as spiritually different in terms of tone. And the reason, and this is kind of the second part of this point, the reason that this is important to the Thomists in the mid-19th century is because they are trying to act against modernism. That modernism being a philosophy which rose in both Protestantism and Catholicism, and that that is associated with personal experience. So that is the modernist, which, by the way, modernist in this sense is not really a thing. As much as the Society of St. Pius X or Sede Vacantists talk about modernism today, the liberals of today are really, in a technical sense, not the same as modernists as they existed in the mid-19th century, who advocated a very specific hermeneutic, which I will not get into. But anyhow, basically, the Catholic Church wanted to emphasize scholasticism as an antidote to modernist subjectivism. And they came to see their one-time allies, the traditionalists, as being a hindrance to this because they were naysayers of or detractors from the rigors of scholasticism. And this really, an event that showcases this would be when the traditionalist theologian Augustine Bonetti was brought before the Congregation of the Index and basically forced to admit, compelled to admit and sign on that he agreed that the causal proofs of God's existence were indeed compelling, and that in no way did Bonaventure or Aquinas lead to rationalism. And so the great distinction between the 18th century Catholicism and 19th century Catholicism is that the type of conservatism in place became decidedly more mechanistic and you might say anti-parochial and anti-subjectivist.
Well, I guess let's start from the beginning. As I understand the Thomistic project, when the peripatetic Aristotelian school came back into Western European vogue via Al-Andalus with thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, there was a controversy about the two truths. There was a truth in philosophy and there was a truth in theology. And Thomas Aquinas, in his way of his school, was trying to reconcile that by saying, no, there are not two separate tracks to truth. There's only one truth. And what appears to be a contradiction between these two different truths are actually apparent contradictions that can be resolved. And part of Thomas's project was to resolve those contradictions. As I understand perennialism, in the beginning of the Renaissance, or rather we could even sometime in the late 13th century, up through the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire to the Reformation. So say between, Boccaccio and the Reformation, we have this rediscovery of classic knowledge, but this time revolving around Plato. And so it has more of a mystical, esoteric property to it rather than a more rigorous rationalism of Aristotle. And even then, some of the perennialists weren't even necessarily Catholic. Some were Orthodox, and I think some were, they wouldn't go around saying it, but some of them were crypto-pagans, though that would have been hazardous to their health to say so. And these are sort of, with some oversimplification, it's a tension between the rediscovery of Aristotle and a rediscovery of Plato. Would you say that's, even if somewhat oversimplified, substantially correct?
That is, provided that one does make that condition, that qualification, that it has to be highly simplified. Something did come to mind while you were speaking, which is that with respect to the origins of perennialism, and by that we mean in reference to traditionalism, it's kind of how long it has existed as a school is kind of contingent on whether or not one accepts their claims. Because, of course, if it is an esoteric philosophy that has its own kind of intellectual guardianship, then, of course, traditionalism would have been in existence for as long as tradition itself has been in existence. And I think that there is this kind of claim that there is this sort of esoteric thread that dates back through all of history. So presumably something like the Hindu caste system, or ancient or medieval Islam or what have you, has this variant of a kind of inward intellectual elite who serve the role that people like de Maistre or Guénon or Evola later see themselves as occupying. And so it has struck me that historically it's more difficult to pinpoint any clear origins for traditionalism, as in contrast to Thomism, which kind of admits of its own origins as being in, say, Albertus Magnus or the very earliest Aristotle.
Exactly. I mean, if you take the perennial school, it goes all the way back to the mythical origin of Western Hermeticism, Hermes thrice great. Certainly someone like Plotinus or Iamblichus would have made such a connection. Now, you mentioned that traditionalists tended to be more imperial, but if I'm not mistaken, in his political philosophy writings, Thomas Aquinas was also in favor of a more monarchical, top-down authoritarian system. So at least it isn't self-evidently obvious that Thomism doesn't have a similar starting assumption when it comes to politics.
Well, you have to remember that both predate the rise of the nation state with the French Revolution. So they are not necessarily at odds in that particular regard. What I would say is that when I articulate traditionalism as being imperialistic, and you made a comment in the private chat that one of the reasons that Richard Spencer may be rejecting nationalism in favor of traditionalism is that he precisely sees the hostility towards nationalism in Julius Evola, who speaks not entirely favorably of nationalism in Ride the Tiger, which is a very popular book, or at least in theory, on the dissident right, or was. What I really meant to do with articulating the imperialistic tendencies of the traditionalists is to say that they are distinct from post-fascist traditionalists, who I think are distinguished by their post-1930s nationalism, when in fact that there may actually be a point of commonality with the original traditionalists and the Thomists that neither of them share with more modern iterations of traditionalism, which just kind of assume the nation state as a given.
Now, I don't think you mentioned this, but at the time, which of the two was seen as a more radical departure? Thomism, which, as you mentioned, certain Thomistic assumptions to get you in trouble in Paris, or perennialism, with its sort of esoteric Platonism.
I don't really get the sense that traditionalism was very much of a departure at all when it first arose. As I said, I think that the church favored it because they saw it as not only arguing against Gallican nationalism and parochialism, but also as a statement against the French Revolution and its rationalism. I think the problem is that the traditionalists went off in too much of their own direction and were not willing to adapt to the Neo-Thomist movement. And I think this would serve as a decent segue into the historical development from this point, where you have something called Neo-Scholasticism, which is initially, I won't say a reactionary, but it's an ultra conservative, at least by today's standards, what we would call traditionalist Catholics, like the Society of St. Pius X or most of the Sede Vacantists, or even like the Fraternity of St. Peter. I mean, that which Vatican II was a reaction to was not really traditionalism. That was not the standing order. The standing order was conservative Neo-Thomism, which is very distinctive in flavor, even if it can sometimes be difficult to put one's finger on precisely what the concrete differences would be in terms of like policy or doctrine. But it is this movement, the establishment of this scholastic order, which Vatican II replaced with the kind of Nouvelle theology, which is what has dominated Catholicism for the past half century, almost a century now, is that their uncooperativeness with respect to the intensification of the neo-scholastic project is what put them on the outside. And the reason that De Maistre is a perfect example of this. The reason that De Maistre did not come under the condemnation was because he sort of predates the actual like full-fledged integration of neo-scholasticism into the kind of replacement like order of conservative Catholicism. So what today is seen as conservative Catholicism are the heirs of the neo-scholastics. So much as like Vatican II, like the diehard advocates of Vatican II are sort of stuck in 1970. I think that what we call traditionalists are sort of stuck in about 1870. And if you want to kind of make this more humorous, I'd say that the traditionalists are kind of set in like maybe 1770. So there is this sort of, I think, sort of successive iterations of Catholic orthodoxy. Today, what I've noticed is that in these traditionalist Catholic groups, as I said, they continue with neo-scholasticism. But when it comes to dissident Catholics, whether they be paleo-conservatives, like at Chronicles magazine, or whether they be neo-reactionaries of the sort of the people who maybe are like the Catholic equivalent of Mark Citadel, and more in that realm, that there tends to be more commonality among millennial reactionaries with the traditionalist Maestrian school than there is with the Neo-Thomists. So in modern dissident circles, it seems like neo-scholasticism is almost more of a kind of boomer traditionalism, whereas the sort of millennial dissident types, I think, and this really fits in with their kind of more ecumenical attitude towards Eastern Orthodoxy, tend to be more perennialist by comparison.
Okay. Now, with the rise of Gallicanism, which you mentioned was an attempt of the French monarchy and nation state to assert its dominance, at least locally, over the Catholic Church. Not that that's a new idea at all, like the Babylonian captivity. It is interesting that France, which was touted as the first daughter of the church, was also the least loyal. Spain was a good deal more loyal than France. But from what I understand you were saying is that Neo-Thomism was used as the rebuttal of the technique to challenge Gallicanism because... sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Perennialism was used to challenge Gallicanism because it was universal in its scope, attacking the parochial focus of Gallicanism. Neo-Thomism was used against modernism to fight essentially fire reason with fire, rather than a more esoteric, mystical, perceived to be anti-rational traditionalism. Is that correct?
Yeah, I like to joke sometimes, and this is partly stolen from the words of other people, but I'll say it anyway, that basically the Catholic Church wanted to counter Kant, so they just turned Aquinas into a Kantian.
Ha! Yeah, I had a professor who was certainly a Neo-Thomist, and he didn't like Kant very much, to the point where, of course, I think he mischaracterized Kant. I actually had two Catholic professors at the same time teaching two separate classes where we read the same Kantian work, and I got two very different perspectives. And it was the Neo-Thomist who was most anti-Kantian. The other one, I don't know what school he subscribed to, but it was a more it was closer to the unbiased, impartial account that you mentioned the history of philosophy was with the author you read we talked about last week. Um, and what's interesting, now, this is something that I find interesting, and maybe you have something to say on this. If you look at classical Greek philosophy, Plato, via the use of him by Augustine, not exclusively, but given the colossal stature of Augustine, um, he's very important in certainly the first millennium of Western Christendom. And then Aristotle comes in a bit later in the High Middle Ages. And this idea that the Greek philosophy was something to be preserved, contextualized within a Christian framework, uh, was a goal that that the Catholic Church strove for. But why was it that German philosophers like Kant, Hegel, and Fichte, who at least on the surface are no more incompatible with Christianity than Plato's assertion that the physical world is imperfect and our goal is to escape it, or Aristotle's assertion that the universe is eternal? Well, why is it that the German philosophers were so militantly resisted rather than integrated as the earlier Greek philosophers?
Well, I would say it's probably because the Catholic authorities who extol Aquinas have gotten it backwards. I mean, whether you are a liberal or conservative, or whether you are whether you like Thomas or against him, is kind of beside the point. I think that questions of, strictly speaking, Catholic orthodoxy aside, that in matters external to the bare bones orthodoxy, Aquinas was not a figure of conservatism in his era. I mean, I hate to sound like a kind of like Novus Ordo, like Vatican II apologist, and that's like surely not what I am getting at. Don't mistake me. But I mean, I think if we're honest, I mean, that's true that the things that Aquinas was trying to integrate were as controversial as, say, Vatican II's attempts to integrate any aspects of German idealism, which to my understanding that they did. In other words, that Aquinas, only after the church's culture had become habituated to the Aristotelian language, is it something that became seen as a force for conservatism. I do not see Aquinas as really being a force of reaction, even if his teaching, if his conclusions are compatible with basic Catholic orthodoxy, which obviously that's what he's upholding. And so in a similar way, I think that that my answer would be that just as there was a strong reaction against German idealism, initially there was a harsh reaction against the introduction of Aristotelianism. Then Aquinas kind of helped to bridge the gap through making them appear more reconcilable than they were ultimately thought to be. And so my position is that really initially there was as much of a reaction against the importation of Aristotle as there would eventually be to the importation of subjectivism. Though if I were to play devil's advocate and to try to explain why an Orthodox Catholic might, in a universal sense, prefer Thomism to idealism, it would be to say that idealism suggests a perpetual evolution or forward movement towards some kind of realization that is an evolutionary impulse, whereas Thomism is rather more static in terms of its truth assertions.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess maybe to phrase this in a slightly different context is not only could one imagine, but one sees a application of Aristotelian principles within a philosophical framework that is compatible with Catholic dogma. Now, while Vatican II might have, in a sense, normalized a kind of Kantian influence in the Catholic Church, it does seem to be that conservative Catholics still kind of view it as either A, not really being Catholic, or being sort of suspicious. But in principle, there isn't really any reason I can think of why you couldn't have a thoroughgoing Kantian equivalent to Aquinas, who tries to synthesize Kantian philosophy with the Catholic dogmas.
No, you could have that, and it is possible to imagine an alternative reality where, I mean, there was a kind of integration in a conservative or orthodox direction, orthodox in the small o sense, that may have been like more easily accepted if Kant were not contextualized in terms of the Enlightenment and of the modern period, which is one of the reasons that I think that they don't like him. Now, I will say about Vatican II, like Nouvelle theology, like Hans von Balthasar and Benedict XVI. You know, I can appreciate a little bit of it, but I can see where the complaints of the Thomists come from, because it all does sound like a lot of sentimental poetry a lot of the time. Like you'll read Benedict XVI like waxing poetic about the glories of the Word made flesh, and how this is something that is part and partial with the like the Platonic logos, and how beautiful it is, and how we can see that this is is indicative of an inward turn, and how even the ancient seer and sibyl were onto this before it was even articulated in terms of Catholic doctrine. And after you've read it, like all of this kind of academic outpouring, you come back after 10 pages and realize you've basically just read a lot of nothing. So, I mean, I kind of admit that although I'm not a neo-scholastic and I have my own objections to the culture of neo-scholasticism, I kind of understand why they see it as like a vehicle for like a sort of vagueness that might be seen as more amenable to like moral relaxation or excessive ecumenism.
Yeah. Now this also is a sort of a point to come off of as well. A few years back, David Bentley Hart and Ed Feser were in some public, well, at least on David's part, tongue-in-cheek barbs, which Feser took it to varying degrees of severity or overreaction. And at one point, Hart has this quip about, it had to do, I think, about animals having souls and having an afterlife, saying that, a dog couldn't express love because it couldn't participate in some sort of Aristotelian context, to make the point that it was ridiculous. And to what extent is the kind of rigid, sort of easily memeable Catholic intellectual really just a kind of Thomist junkie? And is it the Thomism coming through too much, or can you separate that objectionableness that many people have from, say, a more, if you want to go a block on this, a Plumbline Catholicism, without having to bring in Thomism?
Yes, I think I know what you're getting at there, and I really do agree with it. I mean, what I would say about Hart is like that. I mean, I can kind of understand how somebody like with his position and these high church hipsters that we've been talking about, who are not on the Parthenon, by the way, are people that could push one into a kind of sentimental neo-Thomism. I think that the that this is an understandable reaction by people who are frustrated with the kind of husk of modern conservatism. That is, if what you get is a lot of like radical orthodoxy, or this kind of, they're almost like the poor man's version of the perennialists, who are like speak the same like vague in the same vague terms as the perennialists, but at the same time, don't want to say anything to offend multiculturalism, and kind of want to preserve like the ethos of the global village. And you really sort of see that in Benedict XVI's writings, despite his merits. He certainly has them, but it is there. And so I could kind of understand like why somebody would find, if they were Catholic, would seek refuge in a sort of like formulaic neo-scholasticism if they just wanted like a basic, like no nonsense conservatism that is saying, all right, like I see these gestures in Benedict XVI or John Paul II, but we want the actual thing that was in place before 1962. Now, the problem with this is that I don't really think that what was there prior to 1962 really is essential to Plumbline Catholicism, because it had a lot of technical excesses. For example, throughout most of history, Thomas Aquinas obviously was born at a certain time, so he's not the perennial teacher of Catholicism. This, for the first millennia of Catholicism, he wasn't there. Also, certain just excesses about the way they talk about things. Like, so for example, there would be like an assumption, I think, if you really want to find a specific example where I think that like the neo-scholastics go too far in a way that the perennialists don't. They're the kind of people, these neo-scholastics, who would actually have a difficulty with Shakespeare. Like, I think that they're the type of people who would read Shakespeare and think, well, is this encouraging revenge? Is this is what Shakespeare did is what Hamlet did in the play Hamlet? I mean, is this an unjust upholding of vengeance? Is this movie that we're watching too violent? Can we justify the depiction of violence, regardless of, say, what Homer depicted in the Odyssey? If there is an abortion clinic in one's town, does one have the duty to protest it, even if that would be contrary to one's own like physical safety, for example? Like, if you go back to the Renaissance, there were great Catholic composers who are musical composers like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis, who did compose music for the Church of England. Yet they are upheld as admirable Catholics who were sort of suffering it out in Protestant England. Yet the neo-scholastics in circa, say, 1890 would say that they would be in mortal sin because they were writing music for the Church of England. Yet they don't seem to want to apply that standard to William Byrd or Thomas Tallis. So I think that one of the things that's refreshing about the perennialists is that even though they may be more politically authoritarian, there is this sort of like theological flexibility about them that does make them more enjoyable to have a conversation with. Like, there's a reason that I'm willing to listen to, say, reactionary Ian hangouts, or, occasionally we'll take a look at what the Distributist is doing. But I'm not really interested in like listening to Society of St. Pius X podcasts, precisely because there is this kind of like sentimental legalism, which you really see come out in the aesthetics. Like, they'll have these very sort of like garish statues of the Virgin Mary, or they'll be handing out rosary pamphlets, and everything's a formula, everything's a rule, everything is this kind of like propagandistic effort that really does kind of remind you of like the vulgar excesses of like certain types of Protestant evangelicalism. Like, it's all very formulaic and very focused on a certain kind of consumable presentation. And in this sense, I think that it is a detraction or in excess of what you might say is Plumbline Catholicism, which is something independent of Neo-Thomism, it's independent of traditionalism, and it's independent of Vatican II. And it basically is you follow the defined doctrines and a handful of other teachings that are so like certain moral teachings, like don't get an abortion, don't not go to church, don't practice certain prohibited sexual acts and so forth, and that is the Plumbline Catholicism, which I think operates rather independently from both the Vatican II consensus and the neo-scholastic legalistic tendencies.
Well, yeah. To further undergird this, I think all too often this may not be such an issue for the perennialists, but it's definitely an issue with the Neo-Thomists. Is that for 1100 years, Plumbline Catholicism didn't have an Aristotelian bent. In fact, Aristotle had very little presence in Western Christendom until around the year 1200. So you could. The question, can you have Catholicism without Aristotle, has already been answered, and it does seem problematic that these Neo-Thomists would indicate that any compromise on scholasticism or Thomism is, in virtue of that, a rejection or fundamental weakening of the Catholic Church.
Well, I would agree with this, and I will say a little bit something about the historical circumstances of this, that there was actually a school in France called the École de Louvain, which was basically a school that was erected for the purpose of instituting Neo-Thomism as the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. And this really is the period where you see this degradation of a Catholic aesthetics which in the 18th century were very grand, right? They had, it was very much a kind of like of actual like porcelain statues and like darker textures, and there was this kind of fixation on I suppose like a certain drama, you might say, that that is sort of kept alive by something like the Institute of Christ the King, which is not really a traditionalist priestly group, but they're conservative, I guess you might say, and they are incidentally the Institute of Christ the King. Even though I've never attended one of their masses, I'm familiar with what they're basically like, and they have one in the kind of original home, I guess, of paleo-conservative intellectuals, Rockford, Illinois, which I think is still where the Chronicles magazine is produced, even though the Rockford Institute no longer exists. And they, I think, represent a kind of, they sort of continued with maybe like the texture, you might say, the aesthetic texture of Catholicism pre-neo-scholasticism. And so, continuing with what I was saying before, that is, you get a psychological change in Catholicism where all of the romanticism of Catholicism is removed, and it's replaced by literally, one's grandfather's Catholicism. That is, it's replaced with the sort of arid, kind of black and white Catholicism that's associated with, like hastily said masses and priests who give sort of one-line, no-nonsense answers that in which all the priests, for some reason, tend to be slender men with glasses. I'm not exactly sure why, but maybe that's something that they screen one for when one is applying for seminary. But joking aside, I think that that with this whole shift in the language that's used, in the way the theology is formulated, in terms of the politics that they support, because the politics, for the first time, I think, in Catholicism, with neo-scholasticism, compliments of, I think it's Jacques Maritain, become basically the politics of human rights, and the Catholic Church starts using the language of human rights with this new direction, there becomes a kind of concerted effort to ideologize Catholicism. And I think that that's really what makes it more difficult to digest. Like, even if you have somebody like De Maistre, or even if you have these kind of dictatorialists among traditionalism, one of the reasons that they are more easy to discuss with than the neo-scholastics is because even if they are just as severe in some respects, like even if your perennialist is more given to, say, the burning of heretics, there is a sense in which I think that they are less ardently ideological, in that they don't share in the same kind of culture of the late 19th century that also bred Marxists. And I think that that's really a part, and that also informs something like the Randian objectivists. Like, it's no mistake, I think, that Ayn Rand was a fan of Neo-Thomism, that she was a radical atheist, but if you look at Ayn Rand's writing, she thought that neo-scholasticism was just great. And she even there are even instances of Ayn Rand basically praising communism over liberalism or anarchism. And so I think that you'd see with Marxism and objectivism this similar kind of like late 19th century, early 20th century kind of tone that is decidedly, even if it's not always, in some cases it is, even if it is not always as politically authoritarian, it kind of represents like an excess of intellectual authoritarianism. And I believe that Neo-Thomism shares this in common with both objectivism and Marxism. And with respect to what you were saying and about the Thomas not existing for the first millennia, more than that, of Catholicism, I think this is one of the reasons that they were able to sort of write in Thomas in this way, is precisely because, like with objectivists or Marxists, there is this sort of tendency in, like, circa the turn of the century, like kind of from 1850 to 1950, of basically having these total ideologies that are perfectly fine with reading everything backward. So that's my thoughts on that.
Interesting. Now, one last point I'd like to get at is we have this tension between, I guess, what we've called Plumbline Catholicism, or maybe pre-ideological Catholicism, and things that come after. Where, in addition to, well, we already mentioned this in the debate between the distributist Catholics and the libertarian Catholics, that they have the official dogmatic interpretation of X, even though X was never dogmatically pronounced upon. And we see this a lot with these overarching ideologies that these various later Catholic traditions have embraced. So to what extent it is an interesting problem, because when you think about it, because there are, what you have to believe no matter what to be a Catholic. And then they say, well, yeah, but even though it was never officially dogmatically pronounced, it kind of was, or we can infer that it should have been. And then we fill in, I don't know, anarcho-capitalist Catholicism or distributist Catholicism, or socialist Traditionalist Catholicism. And because if you look at earlier periods in Catholic history, I don't see that as much, where there's all these like splinter cell ideologies trying to say that where the church has not spoken dogmatically, their ideology would have been the dogmatic claim had the Pope said so. What do you think is driving this, and why we don't see it earlier?
Well, I think it was a different type of authoritarianism that's developed. I mean, I think that the modern Catholicism is, for better or for worse, in some ways for better, in some ways for worse, I think it is informed by modernity. And in modernity, and in the kind of a congealment of the full development of Socratic thought, you do have this tendency to want to come up with an overarching philosophy that is an explanation for everything. And so this is why you have, like, with Vatican II, with the Neo-Thomists, with people like the Marxists or the objectivists. This is why you have this kind of tendency, and for that matter, since you mentioned libertarians, with Rothbardians as well, this idea to kind of come up with a matrix that has an answer to everything. And so it is a different type of authoritarianism that's more intellectual, whereas I have a feeling that when you go back to, say, the medieval period or the Holy Roman Empire, I think that they were much more pragmatic in their authoritarianism. I think that there's a lot more reading between the lines to have been done. And I think that it was more about these kind of like almost institutional struggles of legitimacy and of like filial loyalties. So I think that there's this sort of advancement from the classical epoch to the modern epoch. So, in other words, not to put too fine a point on it, but I think that with respect to the authoritarians in the medieval period or in the, before the medieval period, I think that more so they were a bunch of Richard Spencers. In terms of the untowardness of their behavior. I think it was much more of this kind of culture of knights and kings and patriarchs and so forth, that while in some ways, it might have been a lot more dangerous, and I certainly don't want to live in those societies. On the other hand, I think that there was a certain like psychological flexibility, or there's a reason that the romantic mind tends to like stretch back to periods like that, even if it then idealizes them. Whereas I think that by contrast, although they may be less dangerous, the modern kind of intellectual authoritarians are decidedly more jarring, and I think less imaginative in a sense. And I'm not entirely sure that they are less dangerous, because to be honest, as much like blood was shed in the medieval period, when you look at, say, communism or Nazism in terms of the toll that that's taken on human existence, I mean, it would not surprise me at all if the like modern neo-scholastics, in terms of the modern state, actually managed to have their society, if it might actually turn out to be more dangerous than the initial medieval configuration. Not that I would support either, being the sort of Anglo-Dutch liberal type that I am. But I think that there is that kind of like sense in which the type of authoritarianism that we suffer from has been has kind of passed on from the more intellectually flexible and decidedly more tribal classical phase into the modern phase, which maybe is more comfortable in some respects, but I think is more intellectually uniform, or strives for a certain kind of ideological uniformity.
All right. Well, we're nearing the end of the hour. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
Just something that I would add to to what has been said so far. I mean, one of the reasons that one of the areas in which I think that the perennialists do ethically have something on their side is that if you look to, say, once again, bring up the issue of certain artists in the Renaissance, once again, this composer William Byrd, who was sort of the greatest composer in Elizabethan England, who was a Catholic. A conservative neo-scholastic would look back and say, that's wrong. He should not have been composing for the Church of England. Whereas like a modern Vatican II nouveau theological type would say, well, no, he should have been composing for them because this is part of the demands of ecumenism and so forth. Whereas I think that that wherein lies the value of the traditionalist is that they do have this sort of psychological flexibility where they would be willing to look back and say, well, what are the circumstances? What were the dangers that he was facing? What kind of music was he writing? What exactly were the type of Protestant he was writing for? What were the risks involved? How would this be received? And so in that sense, even if I would not at all wish to live in a perennialist society, I think that they do bear a kind of valuable antidote to the legalistic excesses of neo-scholasticism, while at the same time, the great value of the Thomistic tradition is in that Aquinas himself wanted to intensify the amount of intellectual discussion, of also highlighting the necessity of devil's advocacy, and of actually making it more acceptable to pop the hood theologically. So, as from the standpoint of someone whose sort of emphasis is on intellectual freedom, I think that both the perennialists and the Thomists have much that is dangerous in them. But both of them, I think, also have qualities that can strongly recommend themselves as well. In that sense, I am disappointed and grateful for the presence of both strands in the intellectual world of Catholicism.
Well, this is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Thanks again, Right Ruminations. Signing off.